settle in and let your breathing slow. Outside, the rain is doing what it always does in the Pacific Northwest, smoothing the edges of the world. The streets shine, the trees hold still, and somewhere nearby, the Green River moves along like it has nowhere urgent to be. You might think this is the kind of story that arrives with panic, but it doesn't. It arrives with paperwork, tired phone calls, and ordinary places that look harmless in daylight. Bus stops, motels, quiet side roads. Tonight, you're with the Sleepless Detective, walking gently through the baffling Green River killer investigation. Not to shock you, but to show you how boring details, patiently counted, can finally speak. You step out of the car, and the cold gets in first. Not dramatic cold, just that damp kind that lives in your cuffs. Your shoes find the edge of a turnout, gravel softened by weeks of rain. Out here, everything looks rinsed clean, but it never is. Not really. The Green River doesn't look like a villain. It looks like an answer that refuses to raise its voice. Wide, slow, carrying tree needles and small pieces of city life downstream. In daylight, it could be a place you'd bring a sandwich. In the wrong week, it becomes a place you bring a clipboard. Early reports come in like separate accidents in separate lives. A young woman missing. Another found. Another name written down, then underlined, then copied onto a second page because the first one is already crowded. You think you are looking at tragedy, plural. Unconnected, the kind of chaos that big cities just absorb. Wrong. Not because the truth is cinematic, because the truth is repetitive. Same kinds of last seen places, same kinds of phone calls, same kinds of routines. And you learn fast that routine is where predators live, because routine is where nobody looks twice. You drive through neighborhoods that blur into each other in drizzle, low buildings, soft streetlights, bus stops with wet benches, motels that advertise weekly rates with letters missing from the sign, places that feel temporary even when you have lived near them for years. And the first thing that hits you, if you are honest, is how ordinary it all is. A lot of the victims in the early phase are young women who are already living close to the edge. Some are involved in sex work. Some are just moving through unstable housing, unstable relationships, unstable weeks. The world does not keep careful track of people like that. The world barely keeps track of anyone, but it is especially careless with the ones who cannot afford to be loud. So at first, the system treats each disappearance like its own small fire. A report taken, a name entered, a description, hair color, height, clothing last seen, last known location. If someone can even say where that was without guessing, you stand at a desk under humming lights, watching a tired officer flip through a stack of forms. The pages are slightly curled from damp hands. Coffee rings stain the corners. The writing changes from neat to rushed depending on who took the report. It is not sinister. It is human. This is how it begins. Not with a single scream, with a filing cabinet. You hear the phrase, missing persons, and you can feel how easily it becomes a shrug in a busy station. People leave, people run, people start over, people lie to family, people fall off the map on purpose. That is the cruel convenience of it, the very real possibility that nothing criminal happened at all. And then another body is found, and then another. You are not thinking about monsters yet. You are thinking about maps. You are thinking about roads that cut between trees. You are thinking about how far someone could walk from a bus stop in 10 minutes before the city noise fades and the brush begins. You stand near a roadside, looking at an embankment that drops away into wet green. A passing car sends a hiss of water from its tires. A man in a work jacket walks his dog without looking at you. The dog sniffs the air, then trots on. Life continues because it always does. And that is the first lesson. You keep relearning. The world does not pause for the dead. When detectives start comparing notes, it is not because one clue glows in the dark. It is because the similarities keep showing up like the same annoying song on the radio. Last seen near a familiar strip, found in a similar kind of place. Sometimes the same river, sometimes a wooded area close enough to a main road that you could be in and out before anyone noticed. The big challenge is almost insulting in its simplicity. The area is huge and time keeps moving forward. King County and the surrounding region have a sprawl that feels endless when you are driving it at night. There are highways and service roads, industrial lots and green belts, quiet neighborhoods and stretches of trees that look like nothing at all. You can hide things in nothing. And the longer it goes, the more cases you are trying to hold at once. Each victim has a timeline, and each timeline is mostly blank. You learn to build time from tiny observations, the kind of observations that sound stupid until they save you. A friend remembers a phone call because the television was playing a certain show in the background. A clerk remembers a face because the person paid with a crumpled bill that was damp. A driver remembers a passenger because she asked to be dropped off near a particular corner, and the driver hated that corner because the light takes too long. That is how you start, not with certainty. With small anchors, you spread the information out the way you always do. On paper, on boards, in folders, names, dates, last seen locations, known associates, habits, phone numbers. The case is not one thing yet. It is a lot of things. And your job, the dull and heavy job, is to see whether those things rhyme. Fear spreads quietly while you do it. Not like a siren, more like a draft under a door. A mother checks the street twice. A woman waits inside the store until her ride arrives. A driver keeps the doors locked, even on hot days. People do not say serial killer at first, because saying it out loud makes it real. But you can feel the city changing in small ways. The way people watch each other. The way conversations turn towards safety without anyone admitting they are scared. Meanwhile, you sit under fluorescent lights, staring at lists. Congratulations! You are now doing the least glamorous work in law enforcement. There is a moment in investigations like this where you stop chasing the scary idea and you start counting the boring details. The scary idea is easy. The scary idea is someone is out there hunting. That thought does not help you. It keeps you awake and it makes you sloppy. So you count. You count the last known places. You count the dates. You count the intervals between disappearances. You count the ways the victims moved through their days. You count which areas keep showing up like fingerprints. You start with names because names are the only respectful thing you have at first. Some of the victims are identified quickly. Some are not. Sometimes the only way to identify someone is through dental records, or fingerprints, or a family member who has been calling and being treated like a nuisance until the body forces attention. And you hate that part, the part where death is what finally makes bureaucracy take a person seriously. The detectives who worked the Green River case were dealing with a volume that crushes ordinary procedure. More bodies, more missing women, more calls. It becomes a task force because a single unit cannot hold it. That sounds impressive. A task force, like a movie. In reality, it means more meetings, more shared responsibility, more opportunities for information to sit in the wrong pile. You sit in a room with stale air and a coffee pot that has burned itself into bitterness. The walls are covered with maps. The maps are covered with pins. The pins are covered with string. You know what the string means. Hope. You are trying to connect points that may not connect. Someone reads out a list of locations where victims were last seen. Highway strips, certain motels, certain areas known for street-level sex work, places where an offender can approach without looking like an offender, places where getting into a car is not unusual. That is the human pivot in this kind of case. The killer is using normal behavior as camouflage. You talk about it in plain terms because plain terms keep you sane. He is picking women who will not be searched for aggressively. He is approaching them in places where a stranger's car is not suspicious. He is offering money or a ride or both. He is not forcing them into a van with a mask. He is doing what looks like business. And that is why the early phase is so hard. The offender does not need to invent an elaborate trick. He only needs to be patient and ordinary. You go back through reports and you notice how often the same kinds of details repeat. A woman mentioned a client who was polite. A woman mentioned a man who did not talk much. A woman mentioned a vehicle, maybe a truck, maybe a sedan. The descriptions shift because memory is a shaky instrument and trauma makes it worse. You learn to treat witness statements the way you treat weather forecasts. Helpful, but not wholly. Still, little things stand out. A certain color, a certain smell, a certain habit, like keeping the interior of the car unusually clean. A certain kind of conversation, like asking personal questions that felt too intimate for the moment. You begin to understand something else too. The offender is comfortable, not thrilled, comfortable. He is not improvising every time. There is planning here. There is a routine. And routine creates opportunities for mistakes. So you gather the routine on paper. You make lists of habits because habits are the closest thing to a signature most people have. Who was seen with a man who offered a ride? Who mentioned a customer who liked to drive to secluded areas? Who told a friend about a client who seemed married, or who wore a work uniform, or who had the hands of someone who did manual labor? And then you do the part that makes true crime sound boring, because it is. You interview people who do not want to talk to you. You sit across from women who have every reason not to trust the police. They have been hassled, dismissed, arrested, used. Now you want their help. You want their memories. You want them to tell you about the men they got into cars with, some of whom are still alive and still dangerous. So you speak softly. You keep your questions simple. You let silence do some work. Sometimes you get nothing. Sometimes you get a few details that feel useless. A laugh, a smell, a kind of music playing in the car, a comment about the man's hands, a detail about where he kept his wallet, and sometimes a small offhand comment lands like a stone in your pocket. A woman mentions a particular stretch of road where a certain type of man likes to pick up. Another mentions being taken toward the river, toward the same general area. More than once, someone mentions a man who asked her name more than once. As if practicing it, you write it down because you write down everything. You become a machine that turns people's pain into ink. Progress feels slow because it is made of paperwork, not movie moments. You spend hours on the phone with other agencies. You cross-check missing persons reports. You track down dental records. You compare dates. You correct spelling mistakes that matter because one wrong letter can hide a match for years. And out in the world, the river keeps moving. When you finally earn a trip back outside, it does not feel like action. It feels like returning to a problem you have been carrying in your coat pocket. You go to the places that keep showing up in reports. A bus stop near a highway strip where the shelter smells like wet plastic and stale cigarettes. A motel with threadbare carpet and a lobby that always feels like it is holding its breath. A side road that looks normal until you notice how quickly the trees swallow sound. You stand at the edge of a wooded area and you realize something grim. The landscape is a tool. Criminals like this do not need a secret dungeon. They need places that are close enough to access and quiet enough to conceal. They need familiarity, the way you need familiarity when you drive home half asleep and your hands know the turns before your mind does. You start to treat every scene gently because scenes can speak, but only if you do not shout over them. Search teams move slowly. They look for disturbances in brush. They look for items that do not belong. A piece of clothing snagged on a branch, a shoe that has no business being alone, a purse emptied, a scrap of fabric, a cigarette butt, a beer can. Tiny discoveries matter. Trace evidence is often small enough to miss and important enough to convict. A fiber can tell you what kind of upholstery someone sat on. A hair can tell you who was near whom, if you have the right tools and the patience to wait. A paint chip can point toward a vehicle the way a breadcrumb points toward a kitchen. Of course, none of it speaks clearly at first. Evidence does not deliver speeches, it whispers. And you have to learn its language. The case grows heavier as the number of victims grows. One careful confirmation at a time. You never say it out loud in the field, but you feel it, the accumulation. Each new discovery is another folder, another phone call, another family told the kind of truth that rearranges their life. The task force carries that weight in different ways. Some people get quiet, some get angry, some start making jokes that are not funny, because humor is the only pressure valve they have left. You walk along a search line, eyes scanning mud and ferns, and you think about how strange it is that a whole life can be reduced to something left behind. A necklace, a shoe, a scrap of cloth, and you keep walking because stopping does not help anyone. Even with all that searching, the simplest truth remains: someone is moving through the same world you do. Unseen, they buy groceries, they stop for gas, they drive roads you drive, they hear the same rain on the windshield, they blend. That is why you lean on procedure. Procedure is the only thing that does not panic. Back at the office, the work returns to lists, names, places, habits. You start building a picture, but it is a picture made of negative space. You learn what the offender is not. Not impulsive in the usual way, not careless in the early phase, not operating in only one tiny pocket. You begin to see the offender as someone who understands the area, someone who can navigate it without thinking, someone who knows where to turn off, where to park, where to walk without being seen. And now, the city starts feeding you tips. They come in by phone. They come in by letter. They come in as breathless conversations at the front desk. Some are helpful. Most are sincere, but wrong. A few are quietly cruel. People who want attention or revenge or just the feeling of being part of something. You learn why detectives cannot follow every lead. Because if you chase everything, you chase nothing. So you triage, you sort tips into piles, you look for specifics, you look for anything that connects to what you already know. A tip that says, "I saw a suspicious man," is fog. A tip that says, "I saw a man in a certain kind of truck, near a certain motel, on a certain night, talking to a woman who matches a victim description, that is, at least a shape." Still, suspects come and go. A man with a record, a man with a violent history, a man who drives the right kind of vehicle, a man who lives near a dump site, a man who knows the right roads. Each one becomes a file. Each file becomes interviews, background checks, surveillance, sometimes search warrants, and sometimes you get close enough to smell it, only to realize it is just another dead end. That is the part nobody romanticizes. The hours spent proving someone did not do it. The exhaustion of chasing your own hope. The public wants a face. Investigators mostly get shadows and partial stories. You sit in meetings where people argue about priorities, about resources, about which evidence to send first, about which lab backlog is worse. It is all painfully normal, like any workplace, except the stakes are human lives and time you cannot get back. Meanwhile, you keep returning to behavior because behavior does not exaggerate. The offender approaches in a certain way. The offender disposes in a certain way. The offender returns to familiar areas. The offender appears to have a comfort with risk, but not reckless risk. The kind of person who can look calm while doing something unspeakable. And that is when you start considering the most unsettling possibility, that the offender is not a drifter, not a shadow from the edge of society, but someone woven into it. A familiar kind of offender, the kind who has a job, the kind who keeps a schedule, the kind who knows how to appear normal, because normal is what most people expect. The kind who can talk to a neighbor about the weather while the rain hides what he did the night before. You remind yourself, again, that evil often looks like just another guy until the math adds up. Still, patterns do not make arrests. You can feel the case pressing on you like the weight of wet clothing. You want the one thing that changes everything. A link you can actually hold. A piece of evidence that moves from suggestion to certainty. But for now, you are still in the era of counting. Counting victims. Counting last seen locations. Counting tips. Counting hours. And in the background, the evidence shelves quietly fill. Boxes labeled with dates. Bags sealed with tape. Items logged and stored because someday, some tool that does not exist yet might be able to read what you cannot. It is a strange kind of faith, not in miracles, but in method. So you keep working the boring angles, because boring angles are the ones that hold up. You revisit interviews, you reread reports, you circle the same locations on maps, until the paper begins to soften at the folds. You start asking different questions, not because you have new information, but because you have learned where people hide their truths. You ask about vehicles again. You ask about voices, about specific phrases, about whether the man smoked, about whether he wore a ring, about whether he had a tan line where a ring used to be. You ask questions that sound small, because small is where identity leaks out. And slowly, you begin to sense the edges of the offender's life. Not who he is yet, but what he must be like to keep doing this. He has time. He has transportation. He has privacy. He has a reason to be on the road without raising suspicion. He knows how to move through the region in a way that feels natural. That is not a name. It is not enough, but it narrows the room. And when the paper stacks high enough, you finally earn another trip back outside to the places where clues sit quietly. Because out there, in the wet trees and along the road shoulders, there are soft clues in hard places. And if you are patient, they will let you get just a little closer. The ditch looks like nothing, just a seam between asphalt and brush, stitched up with blackberries and wet grass. You've driven past seams like this your whole life. Now you're standing in one, letting your eyes adjust to the way the ground drops away. And you're trying to remember that the job is to see what doesn't belong. A search is not a dramatic sweep. It is a slow argument with the earth. You move in a line, boots sinking softly, each step careful enough not to crush what you might need later. The rain has been generous. It has rinsed things and blurred edges and carried away footprints that were never going to last anyway. Out here, you learn a depressing truth. Nature is not a witness. Nature is a shredder. But it misses things. Sometimes you spot the small betrayals first. A crushed patch of ferns that doesn't match the wind. A broken twig that snapped under weight, not weather. A thin trail where brush bent the same direction twice, like something was dragged and the plants never got the memo to stand back up. You crouch, you look, you don't touch, you call it in. Someone photographs it from angles that feel obsessive, because obsession is just professionalism with better branding. A marker flag goes down, bright and plastic, like a cheap promise in a forest that will outlive you. This is how the case speaks, through little interruptions. When the remains are found, the air changes, not magically, practically. People stop making jokes, radios lower. The sound of gloves snapping onto wrists becomes the loudest thing for a second. You don't get used to it, you get competent around it. That is different. You watch the scene get built like a small, grim theater. Tape, cones, a perimeter that keeps the curious away and the evidence safe from your own mistakes. Someone starts a log, writing down every person who enters, every person who leaves, because later, months later, someone in court will ask if the chain of custody was clean. Clean chain dirty work. You stand there and you let your brain go into its quiet mode. You notice what you can. The slope of the ground, the way water collects in certain pockets, the nearby road noise, faint but constant. The smell, if the wind allows it, sweet, wrong, unmistakable when you've smelled it before. And you start thinking about time. Time is the thing everyone wants, and the thing you rarely get. People ask, how long was she here? How long before someone would notice? How long before the killer came back? How long before it stops? You can make estimates. You look at insects. You look at the way clothing breaks down. You look at scavenging. You consult someone who knows more than you about the biology of a body becoming part of the outdoors. They will use words like insect activity and stage of decay. Then they will translate it into human. This did not happen yesterday. This did not happen this week. This has been waiting. Congratulations. You've just learned that the clock doesn't stop when someone dies. It just changes jobs. The forensic work is slow and plain, and it feels almost rude, like taking inventory in a place that should be left alone. But this is the only kindness you have now. Attention, precision, the refusal to hurry. Fibers get collected. Hair, if you're lucky, soil samples, plant material, anything that might tell you where she was before she was here. Because a dump site is rarely the murder site. That's another movie lie. Most offenders do not want to kill where they leave. They want distance. They want confusion. They want you to spend your nights arguing with maps. So you look for transfer, the stuff that rides along unnoticed, like glitter after a bad party. A carpet fiber can mean a vehicle interior. A certain kind of paint fleck can mean a workplace. A dog hair can mean a house with a pet or a jacket worn near one. In the 1980s, you cannot squeeze a full history out of a single strand the way modern labs can. But you can still narrow, still keep the pieces for later. And later, in this case, becomes a very long word. You walk back to the cars and your clothes feel damp in a way that will last all day. Someone hands you a paper cup of coffee that tastes like it has been reheated through despair. You drink it anyway. You talk in short sentences. You try not to look at the trees like they're complicit. Then you go back inside the system. Back to the room where maps live. Back to the phones. Back to the stack of names, now heavier by one. Back to the dull ritual of notification, identification, confirmation. One of the hardest parts, the part no one puts in a dramatization, is the waiting for identity. Sometimes you can tell quickly. Clothing recognized, jewelry, a missing persons report that matches. Sometimes you cannot, and the body becomes a Jane Doe in your paperwork, a placeholder where a life should be, and you hate that you need the placeholder at all. You work with dental charts, a kind of record that feels oddly intimate when you're using it to name the dead. Teeth survive. Teeth persist. Teeth tell the truth longer than most people do. Fingerprint comparison, when possible. Scar descriptions. Tattoos, if they remain. Anything that can pull the victim out of anonymity and back into the world where someone loved her. Because a case file with a name moves differently. It gets taken more seriously. It gets remembered more sharply. It gets a mother calling every week and a detective who cannot forget the voice. The case grows by accumulation. The task force starts to feel like an organism that can't sleep. Notes get copied, photos get filed, evidence gets boxed. Every new find forces you to go back and check the old ones. Is this similar? Is this the same? Is this a copycat? Is this coincidence? You hear those arguments in low voices over tired tables. One detective thinks the killer is local. Another thinks he travels. One thinks the offender is methodical. Another points out the messiness of some scenes. They are all partly right and partly wrong because you are building a portrait from absence. And in the middle of it all, there are the small items, the personal effects, The things that snag your mind. A cheap earring back in the mud. A small comb. A lipstick tube. A purse strap. A shoe that looks like it was kicked off in a hurry. These are not clues in the movie sense. They are just sad. But sadness is not useless. Sadness keeps you careful. You bring those items back, logged, tagged, stored. They go into evidence lockers that smell faintly like old paper and disinfectant. The shelves fill up, the labels multiply. Dates and case numbers become the language you dream in. And while you're doing that, the killer, whoever he is still out there living a schedule. That thought is always present. It sits in the corner of the room like a quiet person you don't trust. You try to outrun it with work. More searches, more canvassing. You visit the places where victims were last seen. You talk to motel clerks who have seen too much and remember too little. You talk to bartenders who listen for a living and can't always separate one night from another. You talk to cab drivers, bus drivers, anyone who moves through the city as part of their job. You learn that memory is attached to annoyance. A driver remembers a passenger because she slammed the door. A clerk remembers a man because he argued about the price. A neighbor remembers a car because it idled too long. People remember the irritations more easily than the tragedies. That's not a moral failure. That's just how the brain holds on to things. The brain is a cheap filing system. It saves what feels useful at the time. So, you ask questions in a way that makes usefulness visible. Was there a vehicle you hated seeing? Was there a man who kept coming back? Was there someone who asked strange questions? Was there a person who didn't fit the usual crowd? Was there a smell? Cigarettes? Gasoline? Aftershave? A work smell? Oil? Paint? Metal? Sometimes you get a detail that feels like it's made of smoke. A man, maybe in his 30s, maybe older, maybe younger. Dark hair, light hair, a beard, no beard, a truck, a car, a voice that was calm, a voice that was angry, a smile that didn't reach the eyes. You write it down anyway. Your pen does not get to be picky. And then there is the part that makes you feel cynical in a new way. The way attention changes depending on who the victim is. You see it in the media coverage. You see it in the urgency. You see it in the questions asked. Some victims get headlines. Some get a line in a brief. Some are discussed like statistics, like weather, like background noise. It makes you angry, quietly. Not because anger helps, because anger is what shows up when you cannot fix the unfairness. So you do the only thing you can do. You keep the files organized. You keep the names present. You keep the details intact. Because one day, the case might need those details to speak louder than the world ever did. The searches along the river and the wooded edges start revealing something else. Dump sites that make sense to someone who knows the area. These are not places you stumble upon by accident. They are places you choose because you understand access. You understand visibility. You understand how long it takes a person to walk from the shoulder of a road into cover. You understand where people don't go even if they drive past every day. The killer, you realize, is using your region like a private toolkit. He is using the convenience of greenery, the endlessness of wet woods, the way a body can disappear behind a screen of leaves 10 feet from a highway, the way the river makes everything feel like it belongs to the river. And then you find a tiny discovery that matters, not because it proves guilt right now, but because it is the kind of thing you can compare later. A a fiber that doesn't match the victim's clothing, a hair that is not hers, a spot of paint, a piece of tape, a knot pattern in a ligature, if one is present, something about the way the victim was left, something that repeats. Repetition is the offender's handwriting. You start hearing words like ligature strangulation in the reports. It sounds clinical. It is not. It is a slow, close method. It requires proximity. It requires control. It is not a mistake. That tells you something about the offender, whether you want to know it or not. He is comfortable being near someone as she dies. He is not afraid of the intimacy of it. He might even be drawn to it. You don't say that out loud at work unless you have to. Saying it gives it a shape that follows you home. But you note it. You build your behavioral picture. You ask the specialists who study patterns, who try to translate violence into prediction. They will talk about offender types and risk levels and signatures. You will translate it into human again. This is someone who can perform normal life and then step into a different one without hesitation. And that means he can sit in traffic next to you. You watch the task force shift into a strange rhythm, part emergency and part long haul. Calls come in, bodies are found, searches happen, interviews repeat, files grow. Then, in between, there are days when nothing breaks, and you still have to show up and do the work anyway. Because that is the reality. Most days in a huge case look like nothing is happening. On those days, you do the grinding work of comparison. You lay photographs side by side. You check whether the same brand of cigarette shows up, whether the same kind of rope appears, whether victims are being taken from similar areas at similar times. You build a timeline, and the timeline feels like a cruel calendar. There are clusters. There are gaps. There are stretches where the activity seems to slow, and you almost feel relief until you remember that a gap does not mean he stopped. A gap might mean you just didn't find them, or he changed methods, or he traveled, or he got scared, or he got busy. Busy, that's the ugliest normal word in the whole thing. You start looking for a man who has reasons to move around, a job that puts him on the road, a job with odd hours, a job that offers privacy, a man who can explain his presence near these areas without raising eyebrows. And you start, quietly, looking at men who aren't obvious, because the obvious ones have been checked. The obvious ones have records. The obvious ones stand out. And this offender, based on what you can tell, thrives on not standing out. So, you check the boring men, the men with families, the men with steady work, the men who show up on time, the men who coach Little League, the men who have a polite face and a temper they keep folded up inside. You hate how many men that could be. The tips keep coming. The city keeps offering you noise, and you, tired and methodical, keep trying to find signal. There are near misses that will haunt you later, because hindsight is always rude. A witness report that is filed but not connected. A vehicle description that matches 10,000 vehicles. A name that pops up in a different context and then drifts away again. A suspect interviewed early, cleared for lack of evidence, and then placed back into the sea of maybe. You learn to live with the fact that investigations are not clean lines. They are scribbles. They are loops. They are pages torn out and rewritten. And then, in the middle of all that scribble, there is one detail that keeps trying to matter. Survivors. Not the ones everyone thinks about. the ones who got away. In some serial investigations, a living witness becomes the hinge. Someone who escaped. Someone who saw the inside of the vehicle, the sound of the voice, the shape of the man's hands, the way he reacted when things didn't go his way. In this case, there were women who reported violent encounters. There were women who described being attacked and surviving. There were women whose accounts sounded like they belonged in your file, even if the paperwork of the moment didn't know where to put them. You read those reports with a careful kind of respect. Not the dramatic respect, the practical respect. This is information paid for in terror. One survivor describes being picked up and driven somewhere isolated. Another describes a man who talked about being a father, about work, about normal things, like he was trying on a costume. Another remembers the interior of a vehicle, the presence of certain items, the way the door handle felt. These are the details you can actually use if you can get them pinned down. So you go back, you re-interview, you ask them to walk you through it again, gently, and you hate that you're asking. You hate that memory is something you have to reopen. But you also know the alternative. The alternative is letting the offender keep his comfort. You start compiling composite sketches. You start comparing them. Composites are dangerous. They look authoritative, and they rarely are. They can send 1,000 tips in the wrong direction. They can make innocent men get stared at in grocery stores. They can become the wrong face. Still, you do it because doing nothing is not an option you can live with. And then, because this is the 1980s and the system is what it is, you run into the reality check that always shows up. Lab backlogs. Evidence gets collected faster than it can be processed. Requests stack up. Priority cases compete with other priority cases. The lab is staffed by humans, not machines. Humans get tired. Humans make mistakes. Humans take vacations. The murderer does not care about your staffing levels. So, you pick what to test first. You pick the items most likely to speak. You pick the evidence that might connect multiple victims. Because linkage is power. Linkage makes judges listen. Linkage makes budgets appear. Linkage turns a nightmare into a case with shape. You send off fibers. You send off hairs. You send off paint samples. You send off anything that might be distinctive. And you wait, because waiting is what the system is built on. Years will pass inside that waiting, and you won't even notice at first. Not because you don't care, because you're busy in the present, dealing with the next call, the next search, the next family, the next folder. And that is how the Green River investigation becomes something that sits on your shoulders like a wet coat you never quite take off. You start recognizing the faces of families who come into the station. You start recognizing the sound of certain voices on the phone. You learn which mothers will call every Friday. Which sisters are the ones who do the paperwork when grief makes everyone else stop functioning. You learn to say the same careful sentences again and again. We are still working the case. We have not forgotten. We will contact you if we have updates. Some days, you believe those sentences. Some days, they feel like you're trying to hold water in your hands. And then, one morning, the case does something it hasn't done in a while. It gives you a piece of behavior you can test, a detail about the offender's approach that seems consistent across multiple victims, the idea that he might be using a specific kind of story, the idea that he might be offering something specific, work, money, a ride with a certain pretense. You take that idea and you do something that feels both smart and depressing. Stakeouts. Stakeouts are mostly sitting. They are mostly cold coffee and stiff backs, and watching the same stretch of street until you start thinking your own reflection is suspicious. You sit in an unmarked car near areas known for pickups. You watch vehicles slow down. You watch drivers glance over. You watch women approach windows, talk briefly, decide, move on. It is a sad marketplace, and you are watching it like a person pretending to be invisible. You look for a pattern in the men who cruise. You look for the ones who come back repeatedly. You look for the ones who are too calm, too clean, too careful. But here is the problem. Men who buy sex are not rare. Men who cruise those strips are not rare. And if your offender looks like just another one of them, then your suspect pool is basically the entire damp, restless city. So you start looking for small deviations. A vehicle that is noticeably well kept. A driver who doesn't bargain. A driver who asks questions that sound personal. A driver who offers to take someone somewhere specific. A driver who seems to know the women's names without being told. And if you get a plate, you run it again. You run it through every database you have. And a few you have to beg to access. You build lists of owners. You sort them. You cross-reference them with men who have any connection to the areas where bodies are found. You check who has access to remote roads, to industrial zones, to river-adjacent land. You become intimate with geography in a way that makes you hate your own hometown. And somewhere in those lists, names appear and disappear like fish under dark water. Some of those names belong to men who are guilty of other things: assaults, domestic violence, threats, cruelty that didn't make headlines. You interview them. You check alibis. You chase leads that dissolve when you touch them. Other names belong to men who are clean on paper. No record, steady job, family, house in the suburbs. That doesn't clear them, it just makes them harder to see. You learn that a lack of record is not proof of goodness. Sometimes it's just proof of practice. The investigation keeps running, and then, because cases like this always have more than one thread, you get pulled into another kind of work. The bureaucratic kind. The kind that happens when agencies have to share information. King County has its own systems. Nearby jurisdictions have theirs. State and federal resources hover like tools you can't always afford. Everyone has their own way of doing paperwork, their own databases, their own pride. You sit in meetings where people argue over who owns which piece of the case. You want to tell them the killer owns all of it, but you keep that thought to yourself because sarcasm doesn't move evidence. So you do what you can. You standardize what you can. You create shared forms. You create shared lists. You make sure that if one department gets a tip, it doesn't die in a drawer because someone didn't forward it. That's the unglamorous battle in long investigations. Information is your oxygen, and the system is always trying to suffocate it by accident. As months turn into years, you start hearing about new forensic possibilities, but they arrive slowly, not like a sudden miracle, like upgrades to a dim lamp. Hair comparison is still limited. Fiber analysis still needs context. Serology, blood typing, can tell you broad categories but not names. Semen samples can sometimes tell you secretora status, which sounds like a spy term, but it just means whether a person's blood type markers show up in other body fluids. It can narrow. It can exclude. It cannot point a finger cleanly. Not yet. So you keep storing, you keep preserving, you keep your chain of custody clean, because if the day comes when better tools exist, you want the evidence to still be usable. A compromised sample is just trash with a label, and you're still working the present, still fielding tips, still chasing patterns. The case becomes a kind of weather system. It hangs over the region. It changes how people live. It changes how police patrol. It changes how the media talks. And then the killer appears to slow down. Or maybe you just stop finding bodies at the same rate. The result feels similar. The task force shrinks, the way all emergencies eventually do when budgets and attention move on. Detectives get reassigned. The case files stay. The evidence stay. You stay too in the only way you can, by refusing to let the folders become forgotten. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes with long cases, the kind where you stop expecting closure, but you still show up, like closure might clock in late. Years pass in the background, while evidence sits in storage, labeled with the careful handwriting of people who were hoping for future technology they couldn't name yet. Boxes, envelopes, swabs, clothing, ligatures, trace samples in tiny containers that feel absurdly small compared to the crimes they represent. You walk past the shelves, and you can almost hear the quiet weight of maybes. This is what cold cases really are. Not mysteries in a romantic sense, not dramatic boards in a basement. They are patient objects waiting for the world to catch up. And the world does catch up. Eventually, slowly, bureaucratically, with paperwork and grant funding and new lab equipment. In the 1990s, deoxyribonucleic acid analysis becomes more practical, more reliable, more accessible to law enforcement, though still expensive and still slow. It is not a magic wand. It is a tool that requires good samples, good handling, and a lot of waiting. But when it works, it does something nothing else can do. It takes a biological trace and turns it into a near fingerprint. You look at the evidence again with new eyes. Items that were once only suggestive become potential gold. Old swabs, if they were properly stored, clothing with biological stains, evidence from survivors, if it exists, anything that might carry the offender's genetic profile. You start the careful process of selecting which samples to test. You don't have infinite money. You don't have infinite lab capacity. You have to choose, and choosing means risking that you pick wrong. So, you pick the best candidates, the cases with clearer biological evidence, the cases where the chain of custody is strongest, the cases that might link to each other, and you send them in. Then you wait again. Waiting in a case like this is not passive. While the lab does its work, you go back through old notes. You revisit early suspects. You reread interviews that didn't seem important at the time. You look for names that keep brushing the edges of the file. You notice things now that stress hid before. A witness who mentioned a certain kind of truck. A report that references a man with a specific job. A note about a suspect who frequented the areas in question. You start building a short list not because you have certainty, but because you are learning where the case wants to go. And then you get what you have been waiting for. Quietly, almost anticlimactically. A lab result, a profile, a string of genetic markers that can be compared across cases. It doesn't come with music. It comes on paper. You hold it like it might break, because in a way, it might. It might break your whole understanding of the timeline. It might break open a suspect pool. It might break a family's hope. into something else. The first thing you do is compare it to other samples. If the same profile appears in multiple cases, you have linkage that no defense attorney can laugh off. You have a common source. You have, at minimum, a strong argument that the same offender is involved. So you run the comparisons. You wait for confirmations. You watch the lab reports come back with the calm language of science, the kind that refuses to be dramatic even when the implications are horrifying. Consistent, match, cannot exclude. The phrasing matters, and slowly you feel the case shift from fog to outline. But an outline is not an arrest. To get a name, you need a reference sample from a person, or you need the offender to be in a database. In the 1990s, those databases are growing, but they are not universal. Not everyone is in there. Not everyone has been convicted of a qualifying offense. Not everyone has been caught. So you have a profile and no owner. It is like finding a key without knowing which door it fits. You go back to your short list. You look at suspects you can legally obtain samples from, sometimes through warrants, sometimes through discarded items, because the law has its own strange logic about what a person throws away. You start thinking about how to get a clean comparison without tipping off the man you're hunting. Because if he realizes you're close, he might run, he might destroy evidence, he might stop talking, he might do something worse. So you move slowly. You do the slow part, proving it carefully, step by step, without letting your urgency show. You pick a name that keeps resurfacing in old work. A man who was looked at early. A man who lived in the area. A man whose life placed him in the right geography, with the right freedom. A man who had been interviewed and then slipped back into normal life. You look at his timeline, work schedule, vehicle access, known associates, any history of violence that didn't quite become a conviction, any pattern of behavior that matches the offender's approach. You do not tell yourself you have your guy yet. Detectives don't believe in perfect stories. Perfect is a lie wearing a cheap suit, but you can feel the thread tightening, and once you feel it, you start arranging the pieces the way you would set up a quiet trap. You watch him. You note his routines, where he goes after work, where he shops, whether he still drives the same routes, whether he still visits the same areas that once appeared in your maps. Surveillance is a strange job. It's like being paid to be bored while your heart refuses to settle. You sit in cars. You pretend to be reading. You learn the rhythm of his day without him knowing you exist. You learn the shape of his life. And the more you learn, the more you understand the terrible simplicity. If this is the offender, he didn't need a secret identity. He just needed the world to keep assuming normal. You wait for the moment when you can get what you need. A discarded cup? A cigarette butt? A napkin? Something with enough biological material to run a comparison. Something that can give the lab a reference sample without a messy confrontation first. And when you finally get it, it feels absurd. All these years, all these files, all these searches in wet woods, reduced to a piece of trash in a bag. You send it in. You wait. The lab does its calm work again, swabbing, extracting, amplifying, comparing. The process is technical, but the meaning is simple. Does this man's biology match the biology left behind in those cases? You know what you want. You know what you fear. And you also know this: if it matches, your life changes. If it doesn't, You go back to the shelf of maybes and keep walking. So you sit in the fluorescent light of another ordinary office day, listening to phones ring, listening to paper shuffle, listening to the rain tap at windows like it's always done. And you wait for a piece of science to decide whether your thread becomes a rope. The call comes when you least expect it, because that's how these things happen. A match, not a suspicion, not a pattern, not a vibe. A match. Your body reacts before your mind finishes the sentence. A quiet rush, a heaviness, a strange flat relief that doesn't feel like victory. It feels like finally setting down a load you didn't realize you were still lifting. But you don't celebrate. You know better. A match is not a confession. It is not a clean ending. It is the opening of the next phase, the phase where you have to build the case so carefully that it can survive the slow, skeptical machinery of court. So you start over. In a way, you pull every report connected to that name. You review old interviews. You check the dates. You compare his work travel to victim disappearances. You look at his access to vehicles. You look at any prior contacts with law enforcement, even minor ones. You look at everything because you are about to walk into the most dangerous room in any investigation. The room where you think you're right. That room makes people sloppy. You will not be sloppy. You coordinate with prosecutors. You plan warrants. You decide what to seize, what to search, what to photograph. You decide how to do it without giving him time to stage a performance. Because if he has been living two lives, he is practiced at acting. And now the task force, or what remains of it, starts to feel awake in a new way. The tired voices sharpen. The meetings become quieter, more focused. Fewer theories, more logistics. You feel the tone shift. Not triumph, just direction. You begin preparing for the moment you will knock on his door, and the world will briefly stop pretending it doesn't know what you know. Warrants are never dramatic when you're the one writing them. They're just long, careful paragraphs that have to survive a judge with a busy calendar. You sit at a desk and you turn human horror into probable cause, line by line, in language that sounds like it was designed to drain emotion out of everything. You list what you know, what you suspect, and what you can prove. You separate the two like they're different species, because in court they are. You attach lab results. You attach timelines. You attach old reports that used to feel like dead weight and now feel like bricks you can stack. And you keep hearing that little internal warning that comes with every big case. Don't fall in love with your theory, because the easiest way to lose a conviction is to start acting like the story is already finished. So you plan, slowly, who approaches the house, who talks first, who stands where, who collects what, who photographs every room before anything moves. You talk about chain of custody again, because chain of custody is the boring leash that keeps evidence from running away in court. You plan the interview too, and this is where you have to get honest with yourself. An arrest is not the same thing as an understanding. The only way you get an understanding is if the person who did it talks. But people like this rarely talk the way you want them to. They talk the way they need to. They minimize. They rename things. They turn violence into accidents and choices into circumstances. They talk like they're reading a manual titled, "How to Be the Real Victim in Any Situation." So you decide in advance what you're willing to listen to and what you're not. The day you move in, The sky looks like it always does there. Low clouds, damp light, the kind of morning that makes everything look unfinished. You ride in a car that smells faintly of old upholstery and winter coats. Radios murmur, doors thump softly in sequence. No sirens, no rushing. Just that controlled, procedural quiet that says, we are not here to make noise. We are here to take control. You watch the neighborhood slide by. Ordinary houses, ordinary yards, a bicycle leaning against a garage like it belongs in a safer world. A few porch lights still on. Somewhere, a coffee maker clicks on. Somewhere, a dog barks and then stops, as if even the dog realizes this isn't the usual kind of morning. And when you arrive, you don't stare at the house like it's haunted. You stare at it like it's paperwork made of wood. Because that's what it is now, a location that has to be processed. You step out into wet air. The cold slips under your collar. You can smell cut grass and rain and someone's fireplace from down the street. You can hear a distant highway, the constant hush of tires on water, like the city breathing in its sleep. You walk up to the door with a small group and you feel the strange disconnect. You've been living with this case in your head for years, but the door in front of you is just a door. It has a handle that has been turned 1,000 times for reasons that had nothing to do with murder. You knock. There's a pause. Footsteps. A lock turning. The man who opens the door does not look like a headline. He looks like someone who should be worrying about mortgage rates and back pain. He's older than he was when the file began. He's got the kind of face that disappears in a crowd. The kind of face you've walked past in a grocery store without registering. Congratulations, you've just met the most common disguise on earth. Normal. You tell him who you are. You keep your voice steady even. You tell him he's under arrest. You use his name like it's just a name. If he reacts, it's subtle. A blink that lasts a fraction too long. A tightening in the jaw. Sometimes you get anger. Sometimes you get pleading. Sometimes you get that eerie calm that shows up when a person has been practicing for this moment in private. He steps back. You step in. Hands get cuffed. Rights get read. The whole thing is over in minutes, and it feels wrong that it can be that quick after years of looking. Outside, the neighborhood keeps being a neighborhood. A car drives past and doesn't slow down. Someone's trash can sits at the curb, lid half open like it forgot its job. A curtain shifts in a window across the street. People are curious, but they're also polite. Curiosity hides behind glass. You don't let yourself think about what the neighbors will say later. The friendly guy, the quiet guy, the family man, the one who waved. Those sentences are always waiting. They show up at every case like they're part of the script. The neighbors never really know, and sometimes the person's own family doesn't either. Or they know and they file it away under denial, because denial is the cheapest kind of safety. You move him to a car. You keep him from seeing too much of who's there. You keep the scene contained. This isn't about humiliation. It's about control. Then you go back to the house, because the arrest is only the front door. The real work is inside. Searches are slow. They are methodical. They are boring on purpose. You photograph rooms that look like any rooms. A living room with a couch that has been sat on. A kitchen with a dish rack. A hallway with family photos. The kind of domestic evidence that makes your stomach tighten. Not because it's proof, but because it's the setting. This is where someone lived a double life if your case is right. You look for what doesn't fit. You look for ropes, cords, tape. You look for souvenirs because some offenders keep them. You look for hidden boxes, hidden compartments, hidden reasons. You look for weapons, but you also look for paperwork, notes, maps, addresses, anything that shows planning. And you look for the quiet, modern miracle that makes old cases talk. DNA, hair in a brush, a toothbrush, a razor, anything that can give you a clean reference sample, collected the correct way, documented the correct way, sealed the correct way. Because the defense will challenge everything, not with righteous outrage, but with technical questions that can turn a perfect case into a shaky one. A gloved hand picks up a toothbrush like it's a fragile artifact, bagged, tagged, logged. It is always strange how the smallest objects hold the biggest consequences. If you're doing it right, the house doesn't feel like a dramatic reveal. It feels like a slow inventory where every item might be irrelevant until the one that isn't. You also collect fibers from carpets, seat covers if you can get them, clothing. You collect anything that might match the trace evidence that has been waiting in storage for years. In the evidence locker, those old samples were patient. They didn't rot because someone preserved them correctly. They didn't get lost because someone wrote the right number on the right bag on the right day. And now, in this house, you're trying to build the bridge between then and now. You move through closets, you open drawers, you find ordinary clutter, the kind that proves time passed here like it passes anywhere. Old receipts, spare buttons, batteries that may or may not still work, a stack of papers no one has touched in a decade. But sometimes you find something that makes the air in the room shift. Not necessarily a trophy, not necessarily a smoking gun, just something that doesn't belong in the story the man has been telling the world. A map, a note, a strange collection of items, a photograph tucked away where photographs aren't usually kept. Even then, you don't announce it. You don't let yourself feel it too hard. You just document, bag, tag, and keep moving. Because the courtroom doesn't care what you felt in that moment. It cares what you can show. While the search continues, you're also building the interview in your head. The interview isn't a fight. It's not even really a conversation. It's a controlled environment where you offer a person the chance to explain, and you watch how they explain. You don't go in with rage. Rage is sloppy. You go in with patience. You meet him later in an interview room that smells faintly of disinfectant and old breath. Beige walls, hard chair, table bolted down because someone long ago decided even furniture should be cautious. He sits across from you and looks smaller than he did in your file. Everyone looks smaller in custody. The myth of control leaks out through the seams when you take away someone's keys. You start with basics: identity, address, job, family. It sounds ridiculous starting with that after everything. But you're not just collecting facts. You're watching his rhythm. You're watching whether he corrects you, whether he relaxes when you talk about normal life, whether he tenses when you get close to certain places, certain years. You bring up the region, the roads, the river. You don't accuse right away, not if you're smart. You let him speak. You let him build his own little fence of words, because later you'll test the weak boards. He might deny. He might pretend confusion. He might act offended, as if you've interrupted his day for no good reason. But you have something he doesn't get to ignore anymore: the match. DNA is a strange kind of truth in an interview. It's quiet. It doesn't argue. It just sits there, like a locked door. You explain it in simple terms when you need to. A profile developed from evidence in the old cases. A profile developed from his discarded sample. The match between them. The probability. The science. You don't say it like you're proud. You say it like you're reading a weather report that predicts something awful. He listens. He processes. He decides what story he's going to tell. Some suspects collapse when they hear the science. Others adapt. They start building excuses that fit the new reality. They might claim consensual contact. They might claim they paid for sex. They might claim they were framed. They might claim they don't understand. The words can vary, but the goal is always the same: to make your certainty feel less certain. So you keep your questions boring. Boring questions are the trap. Where were you in those years? What routes did you drive? What kind of vehicle did you have? Did you know this area? Did you ever pick up sex workers? Did you ever go to these motels? Did you ever go down this road? He answers, or he doesn't. He might ask for a lawyer. He might try to talk his way around it. He might give you pieces, trying to see what you already know. If he thinks he's smarter than you, he might talk more than he should. That's the thing about arrogance. It loves the sound of itself. In the Green River case, the suspect you're circling is Gary Ridgway, a man who worked as a truck painter, who lived in the area, who blended in. He had been on law enforcement radar before, interviewed before, even subjected to some surveillance in earlier years. But the case didn't have the teeth then that it has now. Now it does. The DNA link becomes the anchor that lets prosecutors and detectives pull everything else into place. It doesn't just say, he touched someone. It says, this biological material is consistent across victims and it matches him. And that changes the whole structure of the argument, because serial cases are often made of fragments, witness statements that wobble, timelines with holes, circumstantial patterns that feel persuasive but can be attacked. DNA is the rare thing that is both tiny and heavy. But even with DNA, you still have to do the old work. You still have to build the narrative in a way the court can digest. You have to show opportunity. You have to show linkage. You have to show that the evidence wasn't contaminated, mislabeled, mishandled. You go back to those old evidence logs like they're sacred texts. You confirm who collected what, when. You confirm storage conditions. You confirm how the samples were preserved. You confirm each transfer from one location to another. It's all very dull, very necessary, because defense attorneys don't need to prove their client innocent. They need to create doubt, and doubt can grow in any crack you leave. Meanwhile, you keep pressing him in interviews. If he keeps talking, and if he doesn't, you let the evidence do the talking in court later. But sometimes, in cases like this, something else happens. Negotiation. The state wants answers. Families want answers. Investigators want the locations of bodies not yet found, identities not yet confirmed, details that can close files that have been sitting open like wounds for decades. And the suspect, if he's guilty, if he knows the wait is coming, might decide to trade information for his own comfort. This is where morality gets bureaucratic, because you don't get to choose between good and bad. You get to choose between bad and worse. If you can recover remains, if you can return a name to a Jane Doe, if you can tell a mother where her daughter is after years of staring at the phone, you might have to accept a plea deal. that feels like swallowing gravel. In the Green River case, Ridgway eventually pled guilty to multiple murders, avoiding the death penalty in exchange for cooperation. The number matters, but the feeling matters more. So many lives reduced to counts and charges, like items on an invoice. You sit in rooms where prosecutors explain options. You hear phrases like life without parole, consecutive sentences, cooperation agreement. The language is cold, but it has a purpose. It's designed to hold up under pressure. You think about families in the background, people who have been waiting so long that waiting has become part of their personality. Some want execution. Some want information. Some want anything that resembles acknowledgement. And you, detective, are stuck in the middle, holding both justice and practicality, and realizing they don't always overlap neatly. So you push for what the case can realistically get, and you push for the truth you can extract. If the suspect cooperates, you do the strangest kind of fieldwork imaginable. You take him back out, not free, not comfortable, but present. You ride in a convoy that moves through the same wet landscape you've been searching for years. Trees dripping, roads shining, the river still slow and indifferent. And now the man who may have used it like a disposal tool is sitting in custody, pointing with restrained hands, talking about places like they're stops on a route. It is surreal in the least cinematic way. He might say, "Turn here." He might say, "Farther down." He might say, "Near the tree line." And every time he indicates a location, your stomach does that quiet drop, because you already know what locations mean in this case. Search teams follow, again, but now with the guidance that makes the woods feel smaller. You walk into brush with a purpose you never had before. You look at a patch of ground and think, so this is what he chose. You find remains sometimes. Other times, you find nothing, because time has done what time does, and nature has finished what it started. Sometimes you find fragments that require careful recovery. Sometimes you find personal items that confirm identity later. It's not closure, it's retrieval. And retrieval has its own exhaustion. You watch as evidence technicians work in silence, their movements practiced, gentle. Soil gets sifted. Bones, if present, get mapped and collected. Every piece documented, because even now, even with a confession, you still need proof. Confessions can be false. Confessions can be incomplete. Confessions can be performances. But evidence is stubborn. When remains are recovered, identification is still a process. Sometimes dental records, sometimes DNA from family if possible, sometimes anthropology, reading bones like a quiet biography. Forensic anthropology sounds lofty. In practice, it's careful measurement, careful observation, and the patience to say, I can't tell you everything, but I can tell you this. They can estimate sex, age range, sometimes ancestry, sometimes stature. They can look for trauma on bones, though strangulation often leaves little skeletal evidence. Unless there are fractures, they can look for signs of repeated patterns. They can give families something, a confirmation that the person they lost did not simply vanish into the air. But you also learn the painful limitation. After years outdoors, so much is gone, so much is unknowable. And that's another reality check. Sometimes the best investigative work in the world arrives too late to answer the questions people actually ask. The case continues tightening in the paperwork world, even as it expands in the recovery world. Every new admission, every new location, every new victim identified. It all has to be turned into documents. You'll have to present it. You'll have to defend it. You'll have to let it become public in a way that feels obscene and necessary at the same time. Because the courtroom is where cases go to become history. You start assembling the timeline in its final form, not the messy, working version. The version that will be shown to a jury, to a judge, to cameras. You place Ridgway's life alongside the victims' lives. Work schedules, residences, vehicle ownership, known traffic stops, contacts with police, interviews from years earlier. Those early near misses suddenly become relevant again, not as failures, but as context. You show how hard it was to see him because he hid in plain routine. You also revisit the task force's earlier strategies, and you see them with sharper clarity. The stakeouts, the composites, the tip lines, the massive suspect lists, the frustration. It wasn't that detectives didn't care. It was that the problem was bigger than the tools of the time. And that's one of the strangest truths of criminal investigation. Sometimes you don't solve a case because you didn't try hard enough. Sometimes you don't solve it because you're trying to read in the dark. Then someone invents a better lamp. DNA becomes that lamp, but it's still not a simple switch. It required preservation. It required proper collection. It required someone, years earlier, to bag and tag correctly, to resist shortcuts, to store items that seemed useless. The most heroic acts in long cases are often the most boring ones. Someone wrote the right date on the right envelope. As the prosecution prepares, you watch the human side of the case drift back into focus. Families are notified again, some for the first time in years, because the case has been dormant in their minds, a constant ache they learn to carry quietly. They come to meetings. They sit across from prosecutors who speak in careful, controlled language. They hear what can be charged, what can't, what evidence supports, what evidence is weak, and you see how each family carries grief differently. Some are sharp with anger. Some are numb. Some are polite, almost painfully polite, as if politeness is the only thing holding them upright. Some ask very specific questions because specific questions feel like control. What happened to her? Did she suffer? Did she know? And sometimes the system cannot answer. Sometimes it can only offer probabilities. And families hate probabilities because probabilities don't tuck anyone back into bed. If Ridgway cooperates, he might offer his own descriptions. But his descriptions are not automatically truth. They are a person's words, and a person like him has a long history of using words for convenience. So you corroborate, you match his statements to locations, to dates, to evidence, to witness accounts. You look for details only the killer would know. But you also remember that details can leak through media over the years. You verify, because verification is the only way to keep the truth from being rewritten by a man trying to soften his own shadow. In the meantime, you keep learning about him, not because you're curious in a voyeuristic way, but because understanding an offender is a practical tool. It helps you anticipate what else he might have done. Ridgway was often described as unremarkable, low-key, sometimes socially awkward. He had relationships, he married, he worked, he blended, and he was, by many accounts, deeply hostile toward sex workers, while also seeking them out. That contradiction is not rare. It's the old human trick of wanting something and hating yourself for wanting it, and then taking the hate out on the person you can blame. The victims were not random to him. They were chosen because they were available, because they were vulnerable, because he believed the world would not marshal its full force to find them. And he was, at least for a long time, correct about that. That's the grim social math beneath so many serial cases. Offenders pick victims the system will misplace. You keep thinking about that as you prep testimony, because part of the courtroom story, whether anyone says it out loud or not, is about value, about whose absence is treated as urgent. Now the case is urgent because numbers have stacked high enough to be undeniable, but it shouldn't have required that many. The courtroom phase approaches with the slow inevitability of weather, hearings, motions, evidence challenges, scheduling delays, paperwork that seems to breed when you aren't looking. This is the part that surprises people who grew up on television trials. Real court is not a crescendo. It's a long hallway with doors that open and close on administrative decisions. You sit through discussions about admissibility, about whether certain statements can be used, about which photographs are too prejudicial, about how to present remains without turning the trial into theater. You understand the purpose, but you also feel the frustration. The defense will object to anything that makes their client look like what he is, and the judge has to balance fairness with reality. Fairness is important. Without it, convictions don't mean anything. But fairness can feel insulting when the facts are so heavy. You keep your mouth shut, you keep your notes clean, you keep your testimony ready. When the plea comes, when it finally moves toward guilty pleas rather than a full trial, the room doesn't celebrate. People exhale. A guilty plea is not the same as a public accounting, but it is a legal acknowledgement. It puts the man in a place where he can't do it again. It spares families the uncertainty of a jury, the risk of mistrial, the endless appeals, and it often comes with a trade, information for life. You listen to the terms: life in prison without parole, multiple counts, formal admissions, cooperation to locate victims, to confirm identities, to close as many open files as possible. The numbers involved become staggering, and the word serial starts to feel too small. You think about how, for years, the case was called baffling, confusing, sprawling. In the end, it isn't baffling in motive. It's baffling in scale. It's baffling in how long a person can keep doing something in plain sight. And now, in court documents, you watch that plain bureaucratic language swallow something enormous. Count 1, count 2, count 3. Each count is a person. Each count was a life that had habits and favorite songs and annoying little preferences. Each count was someone who laughed at some point, someone who got tired, someone who had a bad day and expected another day after it. Now it's a count. The judge asks questions. The defendant answers. The prosecutor states facts. The defense agrees to the framework. The families sit behind, listening to their worst reality turned into sentences. You watch Ridgway speak, and you look for signs of remorse, because everyone looks. It's a human reflex, as if remorse could change physics. Often what you get instead is flatness, minimization, the sense that he is still trying to manage how the world sees him, even when the world has already decided. Sometimes he admits more than expected. Sometimes he denies certain cases. Sometimes he claims memory loss, which might be partly true, but also convenient. Years of offending can blur in the mind, but so can years of lying. You keep notes anyway, because even now, even after plea, you still have work to do. Every confession detail has to be checked. Every new location has to be searched. Every unidentified victim has to be compared. Every family has to be updated. And those updates are never satisfying. You sit with families and tell them what can be confirmed. You tell them what cannot. You answer what questions you can. You watch them absorb it in different ways. Some people want details. They think details will stitch the mind back together. Other people want as little as possible because they already have enough images in their head. You learn to ask what they want before you speak. That is a small mercy you can still offer. Choice. In the aftermath, the public tries to make the story clean. They want a single moment where the bad thing ended and the good thing resumed. They want to believe the region went back to normal the next day. But you know better. The region changed permanently. In subtle ways, women adjusted their routes. Patrol patterns shifted. Investigative methods evolved. The idea of vulnerability became part of local memory. Like a scar you stop noticing until it aches. For law enforcement, the case becomes a lesson written in evidence tape. Preserve everything. Share information. Don't dismiss missing persons, even when the victim lived in the margins. Understand that offenders use the gaps in the system as tools. And perhaps the hardest lesson, sometimes you can do everything right and still lose years to the limits of your era. You can't DNA test a sample properly if the method hasn't been developed yet. You can't run a profile through a database that doesn't exist yet. You can't force a community to care equally about every missing person, even if you wish you could. But you can keep the files. You can keep the evidence. You can refuse to throw away maybes. That stubbornness is what lets the future help you. Over time, Ridgway's guilty pleas cover a large number of murders, and the court imposes life sentences stacked so high they almost feel symbolic. Life without parole, repeated, like the legal system's way of saying, you are not coming back. It's not a triumph. It's containment. And for investigators, containment is often the best realistic outcome. It stops the harm from continuing. It closes the open-air wound in the community. It gives families a destination for their anger, even if it doesn't give them peace. But even with a conviction, the case doesn't become simple. Some victims' remains unidentified. Some remains were never found. Some families still don't have a body to bury, and the human mind hates that kind of unresolved absence, and there are always lingering questions about the edges. Were there additional victims beyond the confirmed counts? Did he stop entirely? Or did opportunity shift? Were there cases that looked different, that should have been connected, but never were? Investigators keep those questions in a quieter drawer, because you don't get to answer everything. You only get to answer what evidence allows. You also watch the way the case gets retold in the years after. Sometimes it becomes sensational. Sometimes it becomes simplified. People focus on the label, Green River Killer, as if the name is the important part. But you know the important part was the boring work, the task force meetings, the evidence logs, the map pins, the waiting, the lamp getting brighter, slowly. If you stay with the facts, the story isn't about genius profiling or a single heroic tip. It's about persistence and preservation, and a system that finally caught up with a man who had been exploiting its blind spots. You think back to those early days when reports arrived like separate tragedies, when people hesitated to say serial, when missing persons files got that subtle shrug, and you feel that familiar, sardonic ache. Because you can't stop thinking about how predictable the shape was. Once you knew how to look, predators go where routine lives. They hide in what people don't want to examine. They choose victims the world will misfile. They count on shame and stigma to do part of their work for them. And then, when the case becomes famous, people act shocked. People always act shocked. But you've been standing in the rain a long time, and you know there's nothing shocking about human cruelty. Only volume. The bureaucratic end of a case like this is its own quiet ritual. Files get updated from active to closed, though closed is a generous word. Evidence remains stored. Appeals are anticipated. Records are archived. Task force members move on, retire, transfer, carry the case in their bodies like old injuries. A prosecutor might give a press conference. Cameras show the defendant in chains. The public absorbs the headline like a pill and then moves on to the next thing. But in private, the people who worked it know the real ending didn't happen in front of microphones. It happened in an evidence room when a lab report came back with a match. It happened at a desk when someone connected an old name to a new tool. It happened in silence. And families live with a different kind of ending. Some families feel relief that the uncertainty is gone. Some feel rage that the man is still breathing. Some feel both at once. Most feel a kind of tiredness that doesn't sound like anything on television. They go home, they wash dishes, they go to work. They try to keep living, carrying knowledge that is too heavy to mention casually. The case is solved on paper, but grief is not a document you can file. You find yourself thinking about the victims in a way the public rarely does, not as a list, not as a count, but as patterns of life interrupted. The last time someone saw them, the bus stop bench still wet, the motel hallway light buzzing, the small choice to get into a car because rent was due, because a child needed food, because addiction was steering, because the world was harsh and choices were narrow. You think about how many ordinary moments became fatal and how the offender used ordinary as his camouflage. And you also think about the investigators, tired people with coffee breath and bad posture, staring at maps until the pins blurred, refusing to quit even when the case seemed to have no edges. That's the uncelebrated truth. Most of the work was done by people who did not feel heroic. They felt worn out. If you're still here with me in the dim light of this story, you can feel how the ending doesn't land like a slam. It lands like a slow door closing. Click, not bang. A case like this teaches you a strange patience. It teaches you that evidence can outweight a murderer. It teaches you that technology isn't just progress, it's leverage. It teaches you that the past can be reopened, not for entertainment, but for accountability. And it teaches you to keep one eye on the shelf of unsolved files, because this is never the only case. There is always another folder that didn't get the budget, another missing person who didn't get the headline, another set of remains that didn't get a name because the tools weren't ready, or the system was too busy, or the world just wasn't paying attention. So when this case finally settles into its legal conclusion, you don't feel like the night is over. You feel the night widen. You sit back at your desk, the kind that creaks when you shift your weight, and you look at the paperwork that remains. Post-conviction documentation, victim lists updated, evidence disposition forms that will never truly dispose of anything, requests from families, requests from journalists, requests from other agencies wanting to learn what worked and what didn't. It's all very administrative, and it all matters because the next case will depend on what you learned here. You think about the early mistakes, the near misses, the way information got trapped in separate jurisdictions like water and potholes. You think about the women who tried to report attacks and weren't believed quickly enough. You think about how stigma acted like a blindfold. Then you think about the improvements, centralized databases, better evidence handling, more awareness, the growth of DNA technology, and the slow shift toward treating sex workers as victims when they're victimized, not as inconveniences. Slow progress, but progress. Still, you don't let yourself feel too satisfied. Satisfaction makes you lazy. The world doesn't reward laziness. Instead, you open another file, because that's what you do when the big one finally exhales. This next file doesn't have the same scale. It doesn't have a nickname that the media can chant. It's smaller, quieter, and that's exactly why it matters. It's the kind of case that would disappear if a single person didn't keep pulling on it. You slide the folder toward you, and it makes that soft cardboard scrape on the desk. Inside, there are a few photographs, a couple of typed pages, some handwritten notes in the margins from a detective who probably retired years ago. A missing person, a body found later, unclear circumstances. A timeline with gaps so wide you could drive a truck through them. The location is ordinary. Of course it is. A stretch of road, a patch of trees, a parking lot behind a business that closes early. Places you could stand in at noon and feel completely safe. You look at the report and you start doing what you always do. You start counting the boring details. Where was she last seen? Who was she with? What was the weather? What did the first responding officer note that everyone else ignored? Was there a cigarette butt? A tire track? A torn piece of fabric? The details are all small, all patient, all waiting. You're reminded again that investigation is mostly listening to paper, to people, to the quiet parts of a scene that don't announce themselves. You read a witness statement that says, "I saw a car parked where it didn't belong." That's it. That's the whole drama. And yet, your brain leans in because you've learned what cars can mean. Cars are mobile rooms. Cars are privacy on wheels. Cars are how ordinary streets become hunting grounds. You check the date. You check the time. You check whether any other reports came in from that same area. You check whether there were complaints about suspicious activity, break-ins, anything at all that might connect. The work is slow, but it has a rhythm that can lull you if you let it. A rhythm of comparison and cross-checking, like counting raindrops on a window until they start to form streams. You pick up the phone and call a records unit. You request an old log. You request dispatch notes. You request evidence inventory. Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes the answer is, we don't know where that is anymore. Those are the words that make your jaw tighten. Because evidence doesn't go missing by itself. People misplace it. People fail to label it. People assume it won't matter. Congratulations. You've just discovered the most common cause of a cold case, staying cold. Not a clever killer, a tired system. But you keep going. You keep asking. You keep looking. Because Once in a while, something survives. A sealed envelope in an old box, a photograph that shows something no one noticed, a lab submission form with results that were never followed up, a note that says possible suspect, and then a name with no further action. You follow those trails because they're the only trails left, and as you do, you keep hearing the Green River case in the back of your mind. Not the gore, not the nickname, but the method. Preserve. Compare. Wait. Test again when new tools arrive. You look at the small case file and you wonder what's sitting in storage right now. Somewhere that could speak if someone listened correctly. Maybe a swab. Maybe a hair. Maybe a fingerprint lifted poorly but still useful. Maybe nothing at all. But you don't get to know until you check. You turn another page and see a list of personal effects recovered near the body. A key ring, a cheap lighter, a piece of jewelry. The kind of inventory that feels both clinical and intimate, like you're reading someone's pockets after they're gone. You think about how objects are often the last witnesses. They don't lie, they just wait. And you realize, again, that this is the common thread that runs through all of it. Ordinary places, ordinary moments, extraordinary harm. A person goes out into a normal day and never comes back, and the world keeps turning. And somewhere, a file starts. It's always a file at first. You sit with that thought while the rain keeps tapping at the window, steady and unbothered, and you keep reading the small case with the same patience you used on the big one, because the river keeps moving and so does everything else. And somewhere in these pages, in a bland sentence written by